Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. I'm Disaster. Let's begin. The wet, rhythmic screech of iron wheels grinding violently against frozen steel tracks was the only sound slicing through the suffocating silence of the night. Clack, clack, screech. My breath came out in short, ragged freezing bursts inside the narrow, dimly lit corridor of the passenger car, clinging to the frosty glass of the windows before dissolving into the bitter air. The brass oil lanterns mounted along the ceiling swayed back and forth in rhythmic synchronization with the heavy swaying of the train, their weak, sputtering flames flickering back and forth between a sickly sulfur yellow and a pale, dead icy blue. Every metal joist in the car groaned under an immense, unnatural tension, and the floorboards beneath my boots vibrated with a continuous, low-frequency hum that made the teeth in my jaw ache with a sharp, dull pain. I lowered my gaze to my trembling hands, where I held a thick, heavy cardstock ticket, pitch black, as if it had been dipped in liquid tar, completely cold to the touch. There was no departure time stamped into the corners, no passenger name, and no destination station printed along its edges. Instead, etched deeply into the center of the heavy paper in dark, wet crimson ink that looked as though it had just been drawn from an open vein, were the words, "A one-way journey, departure at the extinction of the last light." The air inside the corridor carried a stifling, heavy reek of wet wool, dried formaldehyde, and stale soot that burned the back of my throat with every desperate inhalation. To my left and right, sitting in rigid rows upon the threadbare, stained velvet seats, were dozens of passengers wrapped tightly in heavy, ankle-length dark coats and mud-splattered cloaks. Not a single one of them moved. They sat with their spines perfectly straight, locked against the high wooden seatbacks like frozen statues, completely unbothered by the violent swaying of the carriage. No one shifted their feet, no one reached into their pockets, and not a single whisper or sigh escaped the absolute, eerie stillness of their ranks. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck, soaking into my collar as I slowly took a step forward, my heavy boots squeaking against the wet linoleum aisle. I leaned down slightly, reaching out a trembling hand toward the passenger nearest to me, attempting to catch a glimpse of his face beneath the low, dark brim of his felt fedora. The light from the swinging lantern overhead shifted to a pale, piercing blue, illuminating the shadow under the hat. My blood instantly turned to ice in my veins. There was no face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, and no trace of human skin or bone structure, just a completely smooth, featureless surface made of a waxy, pale gray substance that reflected the dim blue light like wet lard. As I backed away in sheer terror, the waxy flesh across the creature's blank head began to ripple softly, as if something cold and heavy were stirring just beneath the skin, trying desperately to push its way out. The nightmare actually started at 11:45 p.m. at the isolated, fog-bound platform of Crofton Station. I was running for my life, my lungs burning and my clothes soaked in sweat and rain following a catastrophic, bloody car crash on the desolate interstate 3 miles back. My vehicle lay twisted around a concrete embankment, a burning wreck of crushed steel and shattered glass, and I could still hear the distant, terrifying wail of police sirens and ambulance horns echoing through the dark timberlands behind me. I was desperate to escape the flashing red and blue lights, desperate to disappear into the vast, uninhabited northern wilderness before the authorities found me pinned to the crime scene. Crofton Station was completely abandoned, a decaying relic from a bygone era sitting silently at the edge of the dark forest, wrapped in a thick, suffocating blanket of wet river fog that swallowed the signal lamps and turned the world into a murky, featureless void. The wooden ticket window was permanently boarded up with rotting pine planks, rusted iron nails jutting out like broken teeth, and the platform was covered in a thick layer of slick, rotting autumn leaves. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural train whistle pierced the heavy silence of the valley, a sound so high, shrill, and cold that it felt like an iron needle driving directly into my eardrums. Out of the wall of yellow fog glided a massive, ancient steam-era locomotive, dragging 7 heavy, pitch-black passenger cars behind it without venting a single cloud of steam, dropping a single burning cinder, or emitting any mechanical roar from its boiler. It moved with a silent, ghostly velocity, its iron wheels sliding over the frost-crusted rails until it screeched to a sudden, dead halt directly beside the empty platform. The heavy, brass-bound sliding doors of the second carriage hissed open automatically with a harsh release of pressurized, ice-cold air that smelled of ozone and damp earth. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled up the iron steps in a frantic rush, my heart hammering against my ribs, driven entirely by the panic of the approaching sirens in the distance. I stepped into the dim interior of the train without taking a single second to realize the terrifying truth of the line I had just joined. I had failed to notice that the rusted iron tracks leading out of Crofton Station had been severed, collapsed, and abandoned over 40 years ago when the massive hydroelectric bridge plunged into the black waters of the river gorge below. Chapter 3. The train continued its reckless charge through the pitch-black fields, the steel wheels slamming against the rails at a terrifying, unnatural speed that made the heavy walls of the carriage shake and groan. Out of the rising mist between the cars, a sound began to echo, a rhythmic, heavy tread of iron-heeled boots crushing the wooden floorboards with deliberate, agonizing slowness, thud, thud, screech. The ambient temperature inside the corridor plummeted instantly, freezing the condensation on the window panes into sharp, crystalline patterns that block out the dark night outside. Through the narrow glass panel of the forward door, a tall, imposing figure materialized out of the thick gray haze that swirled in the vestibule between the carriages. It was the conductor, a man built unnaturally tall and thin, his frame stretched to impossible proportions inside a double-breasted, midnight blue official uniform from the previous century. The brass buttons running down his coat were tarnished black, coated in a layer of greenish rust, and his face was stark, dead white, like polished bone carved under a cold moon. In his right hand, he clutched a massive, heavy iron ticket puncher, its forged jaw fitted with jagged teeth that continuously sparked with bright, fiery orange embers every time his long, bony fingers flexed around the grip. He moved systematically down the narrow aisle, stepping past the rows of motionless, faceless passengers who sat like frozen corpses in their velvet seats. Whenever he reached a seated figure, he extended his pale, emaciated hand, taking the pitch-black ticket resting in their lap and feeding it into the jaws of the iron puncher. The moment the glowing teeth bit into the heavy black card, a sharp clack echoed through the car, accompanied by a shower of orange sparks. The passenger's entire body would instantly shudder, their skin turning to a translucent, paper-thin shell before dissolving entirely into a dense cloud of gray ash. The ash did not drop to the floor, it was drawn upward in a swirling, hypnotic spiral, sucked directly into the rusted iron ventilation grates set into the arched ceiling overhead. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, each thud ringing like a death knell in my ears as the conductor stepped closer and closer, leaving a trail of empty, ash-dusted velvet seats behind him. Finally, his heavy boots came to a halt directly in front of my row, his towering height forcing him to stoop beneath the swinging brass oil lamps. He slowly raised his head, his wide, milky white eyes completely devoid of pupils or irises, expanding as they locked directly onto my chest with an unblinking, horrifying intensity. A wave of suffocating cold radiated from his uniform, bringing with it the overpowering stench of deep earth, crushed stone, and ancient decay. He reached out a long, pale hand, his black-tipped fingers hovering inches from the front of my jacket, his mouth opening to reveal a dark, toothless void that stretched unnaturally wide across his lower face. "Your ticket, my boy," he whispered, his voice sounding like two rusted iron plates grinding together at the bottom of a dry well. "You've lingered far too long in the world of the living." Panic surged through my veins like ice water, breaking the temporary paralysis that had locked my muscles. I shoved past the towering conductor with all the strength left in my battered body, my shoulder slamming hard against his frozen frame. It felt like hitting a solid pillar of wet concrete. He didn't stumble, but he let out a low, vibrating hiss of escaping steam as I threw my weight against the heavy glass door connecting the carriages, lunging backward into the narrow, freezing vestibule between the cars. The wind whipping between the coupling plates was deafening, a roaring gale of sub-zero air that tore at my clothes and stung my eyes, but I kept moving, throwing open door after door as I scrambled toward the rear of the train. Every single carriage I stepped into grew progressively more unnatural, decaying, and terrifying than the one before it. The third car had no passenger seats. Instead, it was packed from floor to ceiling with towering pyramids of rusted iron trunks, decaying leather suitcases, and mud-splattered travel bags from forgotten decades. The air in the room was thick and humid, filled with a sickening, metallic stench that made me gag. The entire mountain of luggage was softly pulsing, expanding and contracting like a massive, wet pair of lungs. From the seams of the locked suitcases, a thick, dark oil was oozing out, dripping onto the wooden floorboards in heavy, rhythmic splatters that formed a black, viscous lake around my boots. As I stumbled through the narrow path carved between the pulsing bags, a large, worn leather trunk on my left snapped its rusted brass latches open with a loud, violent crack. The lid flopped backward, spilling its horrifying contents into the dark sludge at my feet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as my eyes locked onto the objects scattered across the floor. Sitting in the middle of the black oil was my own silver wristwatch, its glass face cracked, the hands frozen precisely at 11:42 p.m., the exact minute my car had veered off the icy highway embankment. Beside it lay the twisted key ring from my automobile, bent and stained with dried blood, along with my leather wallet, my driver's license, and my personal pocket logbook, its rain-soaked pages fluttering open in the draft. I dropped to my knees in the freezing sludge, my gloved hands shaking violently as I scooped up the crushed wristwatch and the bloodied logbook. The pages were filled with my own handwriting, recording the events of my life up to the final, terrifying entry written in smeared red ink across the last page: vehicle rollover. Severe thoracic trauma. No pulse detected at the scene. A cold, agonizing realization crashed down upon my mind, shattering the thin illusion of survival I had been clinging to since I fled Crofton Station. There were no police sirens chasing me through the woods. There was no escape route across the northern border. My body was not running through the snow, it was sitting cold, broken, and lifeless behind the steering wheel of a crushed sedan 3 miles back on the interstate. This train was not transporting living commuters between distant rural towns, it was a dark, iron harvester sweeping through the shadows of the physical world, gathering the stubborn souls of those who died violently and refused to accept their own demise. It was collecting us from the blood-stained asphalt, from the icy riverbeds, and from the burning ruins, locking us into these iron cars to deliver us to the final, silent vault deep beneath the earth. I scrambled back to my feet, clutching the blood-soaked logbook to my chest, and lunged through the next heavy iron door into the very last car of the train. Here, at the rear end of the final carriage, there were no seats, no luggage, and no overhead lanterns, only a wide, floor-to-ceiling glass observation window that looked out over the endless void stretching behind us. The iron tracks beneath us were not resting on gravel or wooden ties. As I stared down through the glass floorboards, I saw with growing horror that the rails were dissolving into complete, absolute nothingness just feet behind the speeding iron wheels. The train was not riding on land anymore, it was speeding across an infinite, starless sea of thick black fog that swirled beneath the carriage like a subterranean ocean. The engine far ahead let out a long, screeching wail that vibrated through the metal frame of the carriage, a sound that quickly turned into a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of straining iron. The speed was accelerating to an impossible, suicidal velocity, the walls groaned under the atmospheric pressure, and the glass in the observation window began to web with dozens of thin, hair-like fractures. Through the front panels of the car, looking past the long corridor of empty doors, I could see what lay ahead at the end of the line. The broken, splintered remains of the ancient hydroelectric bridge hung suspended over a vast, bottomless black gorge, 2 rotting wooden trestles jutting out into the empty air like snapped bones, completely severed 40 years ago. There were no tracks across the chasm, there was only a gaping, hungry abyss waiting beneath the dark sky. A sudden, cold pressure at my back made me freeze. I turned around slowly to face the narrow aisle behind me. The doors connecting the carriages had all slammed open, swinging wildly on their iron hinges in the howling wind. Down the center corridor, advancing toward me with a slow, synchronized movement, came the passengers. They were no longer sitting in their velvet seats, they had risen as one mass, their heavy dark coats pressing tightly together as their bodies began to flow and merge into a single, writhing mass of pale, featureless flesh. Dozens of smooth, waxy heads swayed in unison under the flickering blue lanterns, their blank faces turned squarely toward me. Out of the mass, dozens of long, emaciated arms reached forward, hands woven together from pale skin and cold black fibers, stretching down the length of the narrow aisle to block my escape. They did not speak with mouths, but a single, overlapping voice echoed directly inside the bones of my skull, vibrating through my ribs with suffocating weight. "Sit with us." The voice echoed, a dry, raspy chorus that sounded like dry autumn leaves scraping across stone. "The bridge is right ahead, stop running from the crash, the journey is almost over." The pale, cold fingers brushed against my sleeves, their icy grip locking onto my coat, pulling me gently but irresistibly toward the center of the mass as the train roared toward the edge of the shattered bridge. The locomotive launched itself off the jagged edge of the broken timber trestle, soaring into the pitch-black void above the bottomless canyon. For a single, agonizing second, time seemed to freeze, the heavy engine hanging suspended in the starless air, its iron wheels spinning uselessly against the empty sky while the howling wind tore through the shattered windowpanes. Then came the fall. The heavy iron cars buckled, snapped, and folded inward like paper, plunging thousands of feet into the abyssal darkness below. The sound was deafening, a chaotic, horrifying roar of twisting steel, shattering glass, and tearing metal that echoed through the empty chasm like thunder. As the rear car tumbled head over heels through the void, the waxy figures wrapped around me dissolved into cold, drifting ash, swirling through the freezing air like a dark blizzard. An absolute, crushing cold settled deep inside my chest, a frost so severe that my lungs locked tight, my sight faded to complete darkness, and my heartbeat slowed, fluttered, and stopped entirely. The terrifying pain of the car crash, the burning agony in my chest, and the blinding panic of the flight instantly melted away into a profound, heavy silence. When I opened my eyes again, there was no twisted metal, no burning wreckage, and no bottom of the canyon. I was standing perfectly upright on a massive, endless platform constructed from polished black flagstones that stretched out as far as the eye could see under a cold, starless sky. The air was dead calm, free of wind or frost, smelling faintly of old stone and cold water. High above the platform, suspended from thick iron chains, hung a massive rusted sign bearing single, illuminated phrase in glowing crimson letters, Station 0, Seoul Assembly Terminal. Looking down the platform, I saw thousands of silent figures clad in dark coats, all walking in long, orderly lines toward a set of colossal brass gates looming in the distance. In the center of the platform, standing beside a heavy marble pillar, stood the tall conductor. He held his glowing iron ticket puncher at his side, a faint, chilling smile crossing his stark white face as his milky white eyes met mine. He raised his long, emaciated hand, pointing a single black-tipped finger toward the endless line of waiting souls, gesturing silently for me to take my place in the eternal queue. "Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. This has been Disaster on the Radio. 6 chapters, 1 final ticket, and a journey across a bridge that was never built to hold the living. The train has cleared the tracks, the wreckage has dissolved into fog, and Station 0 has officially claimed its newest arrival. Until our next transmission, keep your eyes on the road, check your rearview mirror, and never step onto a platform that isn't on the map. Good night." "Listen, boss, I made a mistake. A massive, bone-chilling mistake. After my mother died, the house felt like a coffin, so I took the first scholarship that came my way and left everything behind. I arrived in this godforsaken country with nothing but a suitcase and a desperate need to disappear. For days, I've been trailing behind this broker, a man whose skin looks like wet parchment and whose eyes never seem to land on the same spot twice. He's shown me everything from closets disguised as studios to crumbling basements that would make a rat pack its bags. Yesterday, I finally snapped. We were standing on a street corner, the rain turning my coat into a lead weight. I turned to him, voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Listen, enough with the tours. I need a place, a decent place, and I'm not playing these games anymore. Find me something that doesn't cost a fortune and doesn't belong in a horror movie." He tilted his head, that thin, jagged smile stretching across his face, revealing gums blackened like necrotic tissue. "What's your limit, friend?" $100. "A month," I said, daring him to argue. I was ready to swing at him if he laughed. Instead, his eyes lit up with a predatory, inhuman glee. He pulled out a phone, tapped the screen, and moments later, a rusted sedan, a mechanical carcass on wheels, screeched to a halt in front of us. I checked the driver, a man with eyes like punctured marbles swimming in blood, his mouth a scarred, jagged line that looked sewn shut, and turned to the broker. "You're paying for this ride." "Whatever you wish," he whispered, his breath carrying the sweet, cloying stench of rot. We drove for hours. The city lights faded into a sickly, jaundiced yellow, then into nothing. We left the pavement, the car bouncing over roots and rocks until we were swallowed by the forest. The trees here don't look like nature, they look like twisted, scorched limbs reaching out to grab the sky, their bark weeping a thick, viscous sap that mimics the consistency of dried blood. When the car stopped, the broker gestured to the dark, suffocating woods. "Get out. You want me to live in the forest? Are you insane? There's no power, no water, no sanity out here." "Quiet," he urged, his voice oily and grinding like bone on bone. "You'll understand soon." We walked for 10 minutes until the trees parted, revealing a house that defied architectural logic. It was a looming, Victorian monstrosity, black stone slick with moss, windows staring back at us like hollow, sightless sockets that seemed to pulsate with the rhythm of trapped, screaming lungs. He knocked. A man in his 40s answered, "McMahon." He was a mountain of a man, wide, hulking, his jaw rhythmically grinding on a mouthful of something raw, red, and stringy that hung from his lips, dripping hot, metallic-smelling gore onto his chest. He wiped his mouth with a filthy, grease-stained rag, his teeth jagged and yellowed like gravestones, and grinned. "Welcome, Mr. McMahon. We have a new guest for the second floor." The house was massive, ornate, filled with antiques that smelled of suffocating dust and old, settled copper. The room was breathtaking, gilded mirrors, velvet chairs, rare art, and the price. $20. 20. My greed overcame my gut. I didn't just rent it, I threw a year's worth of cash at them, desperate to lock it in. But as the broker left, McMahon's smile didn't reach his eyes, it remained a fixed, terrifying rictus of malice. He stood in the hallway, watching me, his tongue, thick, swollen, and glistening, flicking out to catch a fresh, dark drop of something warm on his lip. I didn't know it then, but I hadn't just rented a room. I had walked into a slaughterhouse, and I was the next delivery waiting for the blade to bite into my throat. The house settled into the night, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep, boss. It was a rhythmic, pulsing silence that felt like the building was holding its breath. I sat on the edge of that ornate, velvet bed, my skin crawling. The room was perfect, too perfect. The antiques, the mahogany desk, the heavy velvet drapes, they all felt staged, like a display in a museum dedicated to a life that had never actually been lived. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. I didn't wake up to a sound, I woke up to a smell. It was heavy, metallic, and sweet, like a butcher shop left open in the heat of a summer noon. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and listened. Thump. A soft, muffled impact from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Asterisk thump. Scrape. Thump, asterisk. It sounded like heavy meat being dragged across the floorboards. I crept toward the door and cracked it open just a hair. The hallway was plunged in darkness, save for a sliver of yellow light leaking from the bottom of the stairs. I crept out, the floorboards groaning under my feet despite my best efforts to move like a ghost. I reached the landing and peered over the banister. McMahon was standing in the kitchen area, his back to me. He was wearing an apron that looked like it had been dipped in charcoal. He was hunched over a heavy wooden block, his shoulders rising and falling with a steady, rhythmic exertion. Asterisk squelch. Thwack. Squelch, asterisk. I leaned closer, my hands white-knuckled against the railing. He was cutting something. No, he was carving something. The dim light caught the glint of a massive, serrated blade as he worked. He stopped, picked up a piece of the raw meat, and dropped it into a heavy cast-iron pan. The hiss of the meat hitting the hot iron sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Then, I heard it. A sound that made my blood freeze solid. It wasn't a moan. It was a rhythmic, high-pitched scratching, like fingernails against the inside of a wall. "Stop that," McMahon growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You'll have plenty of time to be quiet when I'm done with you. The marrow needs to settle." He wasn't talking to himself. I looked toward the cellar door, which stood slightly ajar. A pale, thin hand was visible, gripping the edge of the frame, the knuckles raw and bleeding. Someone was down there. Someone was trapped in the dark, watching the man cook the parts of whatever, or whoever, he had just harvested. I turned to bolt back to my room, but my foot caught the edge of a heavy ceramic vase. It wobbled, then crashed to the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the dead of night. McMahon went deathly still. The scraping in the cellar stopped instantly. He didn't turn around immediately. He slowly lowered the knife, his head cocking to the side like a dog hearing a whistle. I stood paralyzed, my breath hitching in my throat, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. He began to turn. The floorboards shrieked as he shifted his weight. I didn't wait to see his face. I bolted for my room, my heart sounding like a drum in my ears, and threw the bolt shut just as a heavy, deliberate footfall hit the bottom of the stairs. I dove under the bed, clutching my breath, listening as he reached the landing. He stood outside my door for what felt like an eternity, his heavy, raspy breathing filtering through the wood, a wet, rattling wheeze that suggested his lungs were filled with fluid or worse. He didn't knock. He didn't try to open the door. He just stood there, smelling of blood and salt, until the floorboards groaned under his weight as he retreated back to the kitchen to resume his grisly, nocturnal feast. I lay there shivering until the sun bled through the cracks in the window, terrified that if I closed my eyes, the next thing I'd feel would be that serrated knife slicing through the mattress to find my soft, unprotected flesh. I hadn't rented a room, boss. I had rented a cage, and the butcher was deciding when to start carving me into thin, delectable strips for his midnight menu. I didn't leave the room for 2 days. I paced the floorboards until I had worn a trench into the rug, my eyes darting to the door every time the house groaned. Boss, the silence in this place is violent. It's not an absence of sound, it's an active, suffocating pressure. I spent those hours listening, waiting for a repeat of that scratching, but the house remained dead. Hunger eventually forced my hand. My stomach was a knot of acid and fear, and I knew that if I stayed in this room, I was just a sitting duck waiting for a kitchen knife. I needed to see what I was dealing with. I needed to know if I was truly alone in this nightmare, or if there were others. I ventured out at midday, the sun struggling to pierce the thick, grime-covered windows. The hallway was empty. I moved toward the room directly across from mine, the one that had always been locked. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small, sturdy screwdriver I'd kept from my toolkit, and went to work on the antique lock. It was finicky, old, and stubborn, but it yielded with a satisfying click. The room was cold. Not cool air, cold, bone deep, freezer cabinet cold. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, but the smell, lavender and rotting lilies, a nauseating attempt to mask the stench of stagnant blood. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It wasn't a bedroom. It was an inventory. Shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling, packed with jars. Jars of preserved specimens. I moved closer, my heart thumping against my ribs, and the light hit the contents. Fingers. Dozens of them, pickled in a murky, yellowish brine, each one tagged with a date and a name. I scanned the labels, some were decades old, some were from just a few weeks ago. My blood turned to ice. But it was the back wall that broke me. It was a display of belongings. Wallets, ID cards, watches, rings, the personal detritus of lives that had been snuffed out. There was a student ID from a university in my home country, dated 3 years ago. A ring with a unique inscription. This wasn't a boarding house, it was a trophy case. McMahon wasn't just killing people, he was curating their deaths, preserving their misery like rare, pinned insects in a collection of absolute despair. I heard a click behind me. The sound of a door latch. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the room, but the doorway was empty. Only the faint, lingering scent of grease remained. I bolted for the stairs, stumbling, my lungs burning. I had to get out. I didn't care about my luggage, my money, or my scholarship. I just wanted to breathe air that didn't smell like a slaughterhouse. I hit the main floor and sprinted for the front door. I grabbed the handle and twisted, but it didn't move. I yanked with all my strength, my shoulder straining against the frame. It was bolted from the outside, a heavy, deadbolt system I hadn't noticed before. Looking for a way out, boss? McMahon's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. He was standing there, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim light of the second floor, a cleaver hanging loosely from his hand, its edge caked with dried, black crusts of previous victims. He wasn't rushing. He was pacing, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator who knows the game is already won. The front door is for guests, not for residents, he rumbled, his voice dripping with mock politeness. And you, my friend, have just moved from guest to inventory. I looked around for a weapon, but the house seemed to shift, the hallway narrowing, the walls pressing in as if the timber itself were hungry for my contact. I realized then that the broker hadn't just made a mistake, he was the primary scout. He'd brought me here specifically because I was alone, a stranger in a strange land with no one to look for me. I was the perfect cut. I turned and ran toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, hoping for a window, a back door, anything. I crashed into the kitchen, the smell of cooked meat overwhelming me now, and saw the basement door standing wide open. I didn't have a choice. I dove into the darkness, the stairs groaning under my feet as I descended into the belly of the beast, where the air grew thick with the sound of frantic, wet whimpering and the rhythmic, terrifying drip of something thick hitting the concrete floor. The hunt had officially begun, and I was running out of ground, my soul already tethered to the hooks waiting in the shadows below. The descent into the cellar was like sliding down the throat of a corpse. The air grew thicker, colder, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and something distinctly, undeniably human. I hit the dirt floor of the basement and immediately felt the squelch of something beneath my boots. I flicked my lighter, and the small, trembling flame revealed the true architecture of this nightmare. It wasn't just a storage area. It was an extension of the house, a sprawling, subterranean network of tunnels dug directly into the soft, loam-rich soil of the forest. The ceiling was low, propped up by rotting timber beams that looked ready to snap under the weight of the mansion above. I could hear the house settling overhead, the massive, rhythmic thud of McMahon's footsteps pacing back and forth, patrolling the perimeter of my new cage. "You can't hide, little pig," his voice boomed, muffled by the layers of earth and wood separating us. "The tunnels have ears, and the walls are hungry." I didn't answer. I kept my breathing shallow, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled into a narrow tunnel, the walls tight against my shoulders. I was deep underground, away from the familiar world, trapped in a labyrinth designed for one purpose: the systematic dismantling of a human being. I pushed deeper, my hands scraping against rough, jagged rocks and slick, pulsating roots. The deeper I went, the more I realized that this wasn't just a place of murder. These tunnels were ancient. There were markings on the walls, not graffiti, but deep, deliberate gouges that looked like tally marks. Thousands of them. This site had been harvesting lives for a very, very long time. Suddenly, I heard a sound from ahead. Not a footstep, but a wet, rattling gasp. I froze. I held the lighter higher, its light wavering as I crept toward a small, reinforced alcove carved into the tunnel wall. Through the rusted iron bars of a makeshift door, I saw a figure huddled in the corner. It was a man, or what remained of one, hair matted with filth, skin a translucent, sickly gray, eyes wide with a terror that had long since surpassed the point of screaming. "Help," he croaked, the sound more of a dry rattle than a word. I rushed to the bars, my hands shaking as I tried the lock, but it was reinforced with a heavy, industrial chain. "I'm going to get you out," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. The man looked at me, his eyes darting to the tunnel behind me. He keeps the fresh ones in the back. The ones he hasn't processed yet. You need to run. He's coming. The vibration in the ground intensified. McMahon was moving through the tunnels, his footsteps vibrating through the very earth I was crouched on. He wasn't just walking, he was hunting with the confidence of someone who owned every cubic inch of this space. "I can't leave you," I insisted, searching for a rock, a loose beam, anything to pry the bars. "You have to," the man pleaded, his voice trembling. "Look at the floor." I lowered the light. The floor beneath my feet was littered with small, bleached white objects. Bones. Human fingers, toes, and jawbones, all meticulously cleaned and arranged in circular patterns. This wasn't just a cell, it was a ritualistic site. The machine of this house needed more than just meat, it needed the psychological breaking of the victim before the final act. A loud thud echoed from the tunnel entrance behind me. Then another. McMahon was close, and he was dragging something heavy, a chain, or perhaps a weapon. I had seconds. I looked at the man in the cell, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of pity and resignation, and I knew he was right. If I stayed, I would be added to the collection. I turned and bolted deeper into the darkness of the tunnels, my lungs burning, my skin raw from the rough walls. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. I was a rat in a maze, and the butcher was closing in. I could hear him laughing now, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, as if the tunnel itself were mocking my desperate, pathetic attempt at survival. The hunt had escalated, and I was deep, deep in the butcher's digestive tract. I didn't stop running until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. The tunnel system was a sprawling, suffocating network, and I was bleeding, scraped, and utterly alone in the dark. Every time I thought I had gained distance, I would hear the heavy, deliberate thwack of McMahon's boots against the hard-packed earth. He wasn't running. He didn't have to. He knew these tunnels like a spider knows the vibration of its own web. I squeezed myself into a narrow crevice between two jagged rock faces, trying to turn myself into nothing more than a shadow. The air here was freezing, and the smell was unbearable, the sharp, metallic tang of an operating theater mixed with the rot of a compost heap. My light flickered, the battery dying, and I cursed under my breath. I had to conserve it. Thump. He was directly on the other side of the rock face. I could hear his breathing, a wet, rattling sound, as if his own lungs were struggling to move under his massive frame. "I know you're close, little pig," he hummed. It wasn't a growl anymore, it was a rhythmic, sing-song voice. "You have such a vibrant pulse. I can feel the adrenaline spiking in the air. It makes the meat so much more tender." He stopped. I didn't breathe. I barely even existed. I heard him scrape something against the rock, a whetstone. "SHHK, SHHK, SHHK," he was sharpening his blade. The sound was hypnotic, a rhythmic invitation to death. "Do you know why the broker brings me the ones like you?" he asked, his voice now right against the rock face I was pressed against. "Because you're travelers. You're invisible. No one in this wretched city even knows you exist. You're a clean break from reality. No family to report you missing, no friends to ask questions. You are a ghost, and I am the only one who can make you real again." He moved away, his footsteps fading toward a different junction of the tunnels. I waited, counting to 1,000, my nerves fraying like a worn rope. When I finally dared to move, I found a narrow shaft leading upward. I scrambled up the loose dirt, my fingernails tearing, until I reached a small, reinforced grate. I pushed it, it groaned, but it gave way. I climbed out, gasping, only to find myself in a room that defied logic. It was a massive, circular space beneath the house, but it was lit with high-intensity, buzzing lamps. It was a theater. In the center stood a stainless steel table, stained with dark, dried crusts. Around the room were jars, not the small ones from the room upstairs, but massive, glass vats. Inside them, preserved in a clear, viscous liquid, were human organs. Lungs, livers, hearts, all tagged, all labeled with meticulous, clinical precision. I stared at a jar containing a human eye, still looking forward, its pupil dilated in a permanent state of shock. "Beautiful, aren't they?" I spun around. McMahon was standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. He wasn't wearing his apron anymore. He was wearing a surgical gown, stained to a deep, dark brown. In his hand, he held a bone saw, the teeth jagged and unforgiving. "This is the gallery of the unfinished," he said, stepping into the light. "Everything here has a purpose. Nothing goes to waste." I backed away, hitting the edge of the steel table. My hands scrambled behind me, searching for something, anything, to use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a scalpel, heavy, cold, and razor-sharp. "You want to play the surgeon?" he teased, taking a slow, heavy step forward. "That's cute. But surgeons understand that the body is just a machine, and you, my friend, are breaking down." I didn't wait for him to finish. I lunged, not away from him, but at him. I drove the scalpel toward his shoulder, my only goal to create an opening, to cause enough pain that he might stumble. He didn't flinch. He caught my wrist with a hand like a hydraulic press, the bone in my forearm snapping with a sickening crack. I screamed, the sound echoing off the cold stone walls. He didn't release me. He twisted, forcing me to my knees, and leaned down until his face was inches from mine. He smelled of salt, iron, and the cold, unfeeling antiseptic of the lab. "Patience, little pig," he whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We're going to take our time with you. I want to see how much of you can be removed before the light finally goes out in your eyes." He dragged me toward the table, and for the first time, I felt the true, paralyzing terror of complete helplessness. He wasn't just a man, he was an inevitability. And as he pinned me to the table, the buzzing of the light sounding like a funeral dirge, I realized that the hunt hadn't just been a test, it was the warm-up for the harvest. Pain. It wasn't just a physical sensation anymore, it was a geography. Every nerve ending in my arm was a jagged line on a map of agony, and McMahon was the cartographer, mapping me out with a cruelty that felt almost academic. He didn't rush the process. He strapped me down to the steel table with leather restraints that smelled of ancient, dried sweat. He moved with the slow, methodical precision of a craftsman working on a prized piece of mahogany, not a human life. The beauty of the human form is in its capacity to endure, he murmured, his voice a low, raspy hum that filled the room. Most people think the heart is the most important organ. It isn't. It's the nervous system. The brain sends the signal, but the nerves carry the message of reality. If I sever the connection here, he tapped a spot on my inner arm with a metallic probe, I don't just stop the movement. I stop the meaning of the movement. I was hyperventilating, the room spinning as the bright, buzzing light strobed against my vision. My heart was hammering a frantic, erratic tempo against my ribs, a desperate drum beat signaling that it wouldn't be around much longer. I had to stay conscious. If I passed out, I was dead. I focused on the pain in my shattered forearm, turning it into a focal point, a tiny, glowing ember of rage in the dark. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" he continued, picking up a smaller, thinner blade. "I wonder, does your mother know you're here? Did she feel it when your soul started to tear at the seams?" That hit me harder than the physical pain. My mother. She was gone, and I had come here to escape that grief, only to find a different, more visceral kind of ending. A scream clawed at my throat, but I bit down hard on my lip, drawing blood, using the sharp, metallic taste to ground myself. "You're silent," he noted, his tone tinged with a mock disappointment. "That's good. The best parts of the process are the ones where the subject is fully, vividly aware of what's being lost." He leaned over me, the light reflecting in his eyes, revealing them to be as empty and cold as the vials on the shelves. He began the incision. It wasn't a quick cut, it was a slow, agonizing separation of skin from muscle. My vision spiked white, then black, then white again. I felt the blade slide, a cold, sharp line of fire, and then the sickening tugging sensation as he began to peel back the layers. I don't know how long he worked. Time in that theater had no meaning. It was measured in the rhythmic drip 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 of my own blood hitting the steel tray below the table. Every fiber of my being was screaming for the end, but the rage, the primal, animalistic desire to survive, kept me anchored to the table. I watched him. I memorized his face, the way his muscles bunched under his greasy gown, the exact way he tilted his head when he reached a particularly complex cluster of nerves. Suddenly, a muffled, rhythmic thumping sound echoed from the tunnel entrance. It wasn't McMahon. It was something else, a heavy, dragging sound, fast and uncoordinated. McMahon paused, the blade suspended midair. He turned toward the doorway, his nostrils flaring. "Ah. It seems the other residents are restless tonight." A figure stumbled into the room, a man, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones, one eye stitched shut. It was the man from the cell, but he was no longer cowering. He was holding a rusted iron pipe, his movements erratic, frantic. He looked at me, then at the table, and a guttural, primal roar ripped from his throat. He charged McMahon, a desperate, suicidal sprint. McMahon didn't even look surprised. He stepped aside with a grace that was terrifying for a man of his size, letting the man's momentum carry him forward until he was overbalanced. Then, McMahon brought the heavy handle of the bone saw down onto the back of the man's neck with a wet, cracking thud. The man collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, hitting the cold floor with a dull, sickening sound. "How disappointing," McMahon sighed, looking down at the broken body. "So much effort for so little utility." He turned back to me, the blade still glistening with my blood. Where was I? "Ah, Yes. The nerves. He didn't realize that in the momentary chaos, in the brief seconds of distraction, I had shifted my weight. The leather restraint on my left wrist had been frayed by the struggle earlier, and as I thrashed, it finally gave way. My hand was free. I was still pinned, still broken, but I was no longer a passive observer. I had a weapon, my own blood, my own rage, and the knowledge that this man was capable of being hurt. I watched him approach, a predator returning to his meal, unaware that the prey had just grown teeth. The leather strap snapped with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the theater. My left hand was free, but I was still pinned at the right wrist, my forearm a mangled ruin of white bone and torn muscle. McMahon hadn't noticed the slack. He was still gloating over the broken body of the man who had tried to save me, his massive frame radiating a calm, clinical arrogance. He was savoring the moment, the way a connoisseur might linger over a rare vintage. "You have spirit, I'll give you that," he rumbled, turning back to me, the bone saw glinting. "But spirit is just electrical noise in the brain. It's the first thing to fade when the blood pressure drops." He reached for my right arm, his fingers heavy and cold, looking to cinch the restraint tighter. That was when I struck. I didn't reach for the scalpel I had dropped, I didn't have the leverage. I reached for the tray of surgical tools sitting precariously on the edge of the steel table. I swept it with my free hand, the clatter of stainless steel echoing like a hail of gunfire. A heavy, jagged bone clamp went flying, and I slammed it into the soft tissue of his neck with every ounce of my remaining strength. He didn't scream. He didn't even drop the saw. He staggered back, a look of profound, bewildered annoyance on his face as the clamp sank into his skin, a dark, viscous flow of blood staining his gown. He reached up, tore the clamp out as if it were a splinter, and tossed it aside. "Messy," he remarked, his voice devoid of pain, full only of cold judgment. "You've ruined the rhythm." He lunged. I was trapped by the remaining restraint, my body arched in a painful, impossible angle as I scrambled to pull my feet underneath me to kick. He caught my leg, his grip like a vice, and jerked me off the table. I hit the floor with a bone-jarring impact, the air rushing out of my lungs in a desperate, ragged wheeze. The room swirled, the buzzing lights, the shelves of glass vials, the blood on the floor, it all blurred into a kaleidoscope of terror. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from him, my broken arm dangling uselessly at my side. He moved toward me, the bone saw now held in a grip that suggested he was done with the lecture phase of the evening. He was going to finish it. He was going to take me apart, piece by piece, just to see what the machine looked like on the inside. "You think you're fighting for your life," he said, stepping over the body of the other man. "You're not. You're just accelerating the inevitable. You're trying to prevent the transition, but the transition is the only thing that makes your existence meaningful." I saw it then, a pile of heavy, lead-lined aprons draped over a hook near the entrance. I didn't think, I just acted. I threw my entire body weight into a heavy iron stool, sending it skidding across the floor. It caught him behind the knees, and for the first time, he stumbled. It wasn't a fall, but it was enough. I grabbed a glass jar, a heavy, gallon-sized vessel containing something that looked like a pickled lump, and hurled it at his head. The glass shattered with a sharp, explosive crack against his temple. He roared, a sound that wasn't human, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tunnel. He blinded himself with his own fluids, clawing at his face. I didn't wait to see if he was down. I scrambled up, ignoring the agonizing fire in my arm, and bolted for the exit. I didn't run toward the tunnels this time. I looked for the source of the electrical hum, the wires. I found a massive junction box embedded in the wall, sparks jumping from the tangled, ancient wiring. I ripped the cover off, my fingers bleeding, and grabbed the primary lead. "I'll see you in hell, you bastard!" I screamed, jamming the lead into the exposed pipework of the theater's cooling system. The reaction was instantaneous. A violent, blue-white arc of electricity jumped across the room, vaporizing the liquid in the vials, turning the theater into a strobe-lit nightmare of hissing steam and shattering glass. The lights exploded, one by one, plunging the room into a deep, pulsing darkness that was broken only by the recurring, lethal flash of the electrical fire. McMahon was screaming now, but it wasn't the scream of a man in pain, it was the shriek of a machine being overloaded. He was vibrating, his body convulsing in the rhythm of the current. I didn't stay to watch the end. I turned and ran, blinded by the flashes, guided only by the sheer, desperate instinct to be anywhere but in that room. The house was screaming, the walls were groaning, and I knew that if I didn't get to the surface, I would be buried alive in the tomb of the man who had tried to turn my life into a ledger of parts. I was out of the theater, out of the cellar, and sprinting into the suffocating, freezing dark of the tunnels, my heart a ticking bomb, and the butcher's screams echoing in the marrow of my bones. The tunnels didn't just end, they exhaled. I burst through a rotted wooden hatch and tumbled out into the wet, freezing grass of the forest, the cool night air hitting my fevered skin like a bucket of ice water. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I scrambled to my feet, my boots sliding in the mud, my broken arm flopping against my chest with every ragged step I took. Behind me, the house was a jagged silhouette against the bruised, moonlit sky, a dark, brooding gargoyle that felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to falter. I was deep in the woods, the trees towering over me like skeletal sentinels. Every shadow looked like a butcher, every rustle of the wind sounded like McMahon's heavy, rhythmic tread. My pulse was a frantic, irregular thud in my ears, and the pain in my arm had shifted from a sharp, localized fire to a dull, throbbing ache that radiated all the way to my shoulder. I had to find the road. I had to find a person, a car, a light, anything that wasn't part of this nightmare. "You can't leave." The voice didn't come from behind me. It came from the trees, echoed by the wind, distorted by the sheer, terrifying isolation of the forest. It was McMahon. He was alive. The electrical surge hadn't killed him, it had only fueled his rage. I could hear him crashing through the brush, not with the stealth of a hunter, but with the unstoppable, mindless momentum of a runaway freight train. He was destroying the forest as he came, snapping saplings like toothpicks and tearing through the undergrowth with a savage, guttural roar. I turned and bolted, my feet finding purchase on a narrow deer trail. I was a phantom, a flickering light in the vast, impenetrable dark of the woods. I knew the ground would eventually slope down toward the valley, and if I could reach the lowlands, I might find the highway. But the forest was alive, the roots seemed to reach out for my ankles, the branches clawed at my face, and the fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the path until I was moving by feel alone. I hit a clearing and froze. The ground beneath me wasn't soil, it was soft, yielding, and suspiciously uneven. I struck a match, the small flame struggling against the damp air, and my stomach turned. The clearing was a graveyard, not a formal one, but a mass grave, the earth humped and sunken, littered with the remnants of the lives McMahon had catalogued. Clothing, shoes, shreds of luggage, the surface of the ground was a patchwork of human memory. And right in the center stood a single, massive oak tree, its bark scarred with those same tally marks I had seen in the tunnels. It was the master record. There you are. I didn't turn around. I dove behind the trunk of the oak just as a heavy, iron-weighted chain whipped through the air where my head had been a second before. It struck the tree with the sound of a bell, showering me in bark and dust. McMahon emerged from the fog, his surgical gown shredded, his face a ruin of blood and blackened, singed flesh. He wasn't just injured, he was monstrous, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if the electricity had bridged some gap in his own humanity. He was holding a rusted, meat hook-tipped chain, the metal gleaming with a faint, iridescent sheen in the moonlight. "I'm going to display you," he croaked, his voice cracking like dry wood. "I'm going to hang you from the highest branch and let the forest feed on your memory until you're nothing but a hollow shell." I looked up at the branch above me. It was thick, gnarled, and long. A perfect gallows. "Come and get me, you piece of shit!" I screamed, the rage finally overtaking the terror. I grabbed a jagged, protruding knot on the tree trunk and used it to swing myself around, putting the massive bulk of the oak between us. He didn't hesitate. He charged the tree, the chain whistling as he swung it in a wide, lethal arc. He slammed into the trunk, the impact vibrating through my very bones, and the tree groaned, a deep, mournful sound that echoed through the forest. I didn't stay behind the tree. I dropped into the mud, crawled between his legs, and stood up, driving my good elbow into the back of his knee. He buckled, his weight carrying him forward, and for a fleeting second, he was off balance. I grabbed the dangling end of his chain, looped it around the base of a thick, protruding root, and yanked with everything I had. He went down hard, face first into the mud, the chain pulling taut. He scrambled to get up, but he was trapped, tethered to the very earth he claimed to own. I didn't wait for him to break free. I turned and ran, the sound of his frustrated, animalistic howls fading into the distance. I was a man possessed, a living, breathing testament to the fact that not even the butcher could harvest everything. I hit the edge of the forest, the highway lights glowing like distant, salvation-filled stars on the horizon, and for the first time in an eternity, I began to believe that I might actually survive. The asphalt was cold, a stark, blissful contrast to the rot-scented mud of the forest floor. I collapsed onto the shoulder, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that burned my throat. The distant, lonely hum of a long-haul truck engine drifted toward me from the darkness, a sound more beautiful than any choir. I scrambled to my feet, waving my good arm like a madman, tears of exhaustion and relief carving clean tracks through the dirt and dried blood on my face. The truck, a massive, rusted-out freighter, slowed down, its air brakes hissing like a dying beast. The cab door swung open, and a man with a tired, unshaven face leaned out. "You look like you've been dragged through hell, son. You need a ride?" "Please," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "Just get me away from here." I climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of stale coffee and diesel fuel hitting me like a physical comfort. As the truck lurched back onto the road, the rhythmic thrum of the wheels was the sweetest lullaby I'd ever heard. I looked back through the side mirror, straining my eyes into the retreating darkness of the forest. I expected to see him, McMahon, the butcher, the monster, bursting out of the trees, his chain swinging, his silhouette a permanent stain on my psyche. But there was nothing. Just the endless, rolling blackness of the tree line. "Rough night?" the driver asked, glancing at my broken, hanging arm. He didn't ask how it happened. In this part of the world, people learned early on that some questions were better left unasked. "You have no idea," I replied, staring straight ahead at the headlights cutting through the fog. "We're heading to the city," he said, tapping the steering wheel. "A few hours. You can sleep, I won't mind." I nodded, my eyes heavy. But as I closed them, the image of the gallery of the unfinished flashed behind my lids. The jars. The organs. The tally marks on the tree. McMahon had said I was a ghost, a traveler with no trace. If I reached the city, would I be safe, or would I just be entering another part of his map? The broker, where was he? He hadn't just been a facilitator, he was the primary gear in the machine. As long as he was out there, feeding the butcher, no one was safe. Suddenly, the truck hit a massive pothole, the entire cabin jolting violently. I sat bolt upright, my heart racing. "Sorry about that," the driver muttered. These roads are falling apart. Lack of maintenance, I guess. I looked out the window. The terrain was changing. The dense, ancient forest had given way to sprawling, abandoned industrial zones, crumbling factories, rusted skeletal frames of warehouses, and fields of twisted, abandoned machinery. It looked like a graveyard of the industrial age, a wasteland of forgotten utility. It felt familiar. Where exactly are we going? I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The outskirts. Central Terminal, the driver replied, his voice flat, emotionless. I leaned forward, looking at the dashboard. There was no radio. There was no GPS. Just a single, flickering gauge that seemed to be counting down, the needle twitching in time with my own heartbeat. Stop the truck, I said, my voice rising. We're almost there, boss. The delivery needs to be made on time. My blood turned to ice. Boss, he had called me that, just like McMahon. Just like the broker. I reached for the door handle, but it was locked, a heavy, mechanical deadbolt that looked suspiciously like the one on the mansion's front door. I looked at the driver, and for the first time, I noticed the way his shirt collar sat. It was perfectly, disturbingly stiff, hiding a jagged, puckered scar that ran all the way around his throat. You, I whispered, my hand reaching for a heavy metal thermos on the floorboard. He didn't look at me. He just smiled, a thin, paper-dry stretching of his lips that I had seen before on a face made of wet parchment. The forest isn't the only place with roots, friend. You thought you were escaping, but you were just moving from one cell to another. Did you really think $100 would buy you a future? The truck swerved, pulling off the main highway onto a dirt track that led directly into the heart of the industrial wasteland. Ahead, a massive structure loomed, a dark, concrete monolith that looked like a mirror image of the house in the woods, but scaled up 1,000 times. It was a processing plant. And as the gates swung open to receive us, I saw hundreds of people, dazed, hollow-eyed, shuffling like cattle, being led inside by men who looked exactly like the broker. My journey hadn't ended, it had only just revealed the true size of the butcher's reach. I wasn't just a guest, I was a delivery. And the machine was hungrier than I could ever have imagined. The truck didn't stop, it glided into the maw of the facility, the massive steel gates sliding shut behind us with a sound like a guillotine. The air inside the complex was thick, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of heavy machinery, not the screech of gears, but a dull, rhythmic thudding that sounded suspiciously like a colossal heart beating in the dark. The driver brought the truck to a halt in a cavernous loading bay lit by flickering, high-pressure sodium lamps that bathed everything in a jaundiced, sickening orange. He didn't look at me, he simply tapped a switch on the console. The door locks released with a sharp clack. Delivery completed, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any human inflection. I didn't wait. I threw the door open and hit the concrete running. My broken arm throbbed in rhythm with the factory's hum, a stabbing, white-hot reminder that I was still physically tethered to this nightmare. I sprinted toward what looked like an exit, but the geometry of the place was wrong. The hallways looped, the doors I passed led back into the same loading bay, or into rooms filled with rows of empty, stainless steel lockers, thousands of them, stretching into the gloom, each labeled with a name, a date, and a serial number. I was in a mass production facility for human suffering. Looking for a way out, a voice echoed. It wasn't the broker, and it wasn't McMahon. It was a chorus, a dozen voices, all overlapping, all layered in a dissonant, mechanical harmony. I spun around, my back hitting a wall. Emerging from the shadows were the residents. They weren't just the gaunt, broken men I'd seen in the basement, they were people who had been processed. Their movements were robotic, precise, and devoid of any individual agency. They were walking in a perfect, synchronized line toward a massive central chute that descended into the floor. We are the inventory, they chanted, their eyes vacant, fixed on some point in the infinite distance. We are the parts that complete the whole. I realized then that McMahon wasn't the master, he was just a technician. He was a low-level harvester, a boutique surgeon for the elite, but this was the scale of the operation. They weren't just killing people, they were dismantling them, cataloging their neurochemistry, harvesting their very capacity for emotion, and feeding it into some monstrous, unseen engine that powered the architecture of the world around us. I scrambled up a rusted ladder leading to a catwalk overlooking the main floor. From up here, the scale of it was staggering. It was an assembly line of anatomy. Massive vats of brine, centrifuges the size of houses, and long, conveyor belts carrying components, limbs, organs, tissues, wrapped in industrial plastic. Then I saw him. McMahon was down there. He was standing on a raised platform, his clothes changed into a pristine, white laboratory coat. He wasn't limping, he wasn't burned. He looked refreshed, focused. He was monitoring a series of gauges, his hands flying across a control panel. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his gaze locked onto mine on the catwalk. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a student fail a simple, remedial task. You're a persistent variable, his voice boomed through the facility's PA system, distorting into a metallic screech. But you're also a finite one. You've brought your own biological data into the system, and that makes you an asset. Do you have any idea how much your rage is worth on the open market? It's a rare, high-octane fuel for the next phase. He hit a button, and the catwalk beneath me began to shudder. The floor plating slid away, and I lunged for the railing, my fingers gripping the cold, oily steel. Below me, a massive, grinding maw of iron teeth started to rotate, a biological shredder designed for total reclamation. You aren't a human anymore, McMahon continued, his voice ringing out over the roar of the machine. You're a raw resource. And it's time to be refined. The catwalk gave way completely. I swung out, my body dangling over the shredder, the heat and the stench of pulverized organic matter rising to meet me. I looked down, and I saw the faces, hundreds of them, preserved in the grime and the grease of the machine, all looking up at me with a silent, desperate plea. They weren't dead. They were integrated. They were part of the infrastructure. I swung, my legs kicking out, and caught the edge of an overhead pipe. I hauled myself up, my broken arm screaming in protest, and looked toward the upper reaches of the factory. There were ventilation shafts, small, cramped, and leading who knows where. It was my only hope. I didn't care if it led to another basement or the heart of the sun. I just had to get off this assembly line. I climbed, the metal biting into my skin, the shredder's roar a deafening testament to the price of being human in a world that wanted only to consume us. I squeezed into the ventilation shaft, the metal walls pressing against my shoulders like a coffin lid. It was pitch black, save for the rhythmic, pulsing amber light that leaked through the great gaps, a light that beat with the same sickening frequency as the factory's primary hum. My broken arm was a useless, searing weight, but I forced myself to pull, clawing at the rivets to drag my body forward. I wasn't human anymore, I was a desperate animal, a heartbeat trying to outrun a meat grinder. As I crawled, I realized the sounds were changing. The industrial roar of the shredder was fading, replaced by a soft, melodic ticking, like a million clocks all synchronizing at once. I reached a junction and peered through a rusted vent. Below me wasn't another assembly line, it was a cathedral of glass and copper. Thousands of jars, arranged in perfect, concentric circles, glowing with bioluminescent fluid. In the center, a massive, crystalline structure pulsated, tethered to the ceiling by translucent cables. It was a central processor, a brain made of harvested consciousness, powered by the essence of every person who had ever been delivered here. I saw the broker. He was standing at a console, his parchment skin appearing almost translucent in the glow. He was holding a ledger, a leather-bound book made from skin, and he was writing. Each stroke of his pen was met with a surge of light from the processor. He wasn't just managing logistics, he was archiving identities, deleting errors, and preserving assets for the final simulation. "The inventory is stable," he whispered, his voice projected through the ventilation system. "The new arrival has added significant defiance to the aggregate. It will stabilize the sector's unpredictability." He was talking about me. My rage, my trauma, my desperate struggle to survive. It wasn't a threat. It was a nutrient. It was the signature they needed to balance their experiment. I felt a surge of nausea. Every time I had fought back, I had been feeding the machine, adding value to the system I was trying to destroy. I looked at my hand. My skin felt cold, numb, and my pulse seemed to be sinking with the ticking below. The air in the shaft wasn't stale, it was sweet, chemically enriched with something that made my thoughts sluggish, compliant, and strangely serene. "Don't think," a voice whispered, my own voice, drained of all personality. "Just integrate." I shook my head, slamming it against the metal wall. The pain helped, but the lethargy was creeping in, a velvet weight trying to pull my consciousness into the hive mind. I realized then the facility was a dampener. It didn't just harvest, it refined the human spirit until there was nothing left but a docile signal. I reached the end of the shaft and kicked the grate out. It plummeted into the darkness with a loud clatter. The broker didn't turn. He kept writing. "You're late, boss. The integration process is halfway through initialization. You're fulfilling your role as the final catalyst." I didn't care. I reached into my bag, my travel bag, the one I'd been clutching like a lifeline, and pulled out the one thing I hadn't used. A heavy, antique brass compass, the only piece of my past untouched by the house. It was weighted, sharp, and entirely analog. I aimed for the crystalline structure in the center. I threw the compass with every ounce of remaining strength, a desperate projectile in a world of high-tech horror. It tumbled, glinting in the light, and struck the crystal at the perfect angle. The sound was not a crack. It was a shatter, a pure, discordant note that vibrated through the facility, causing the jars to vibrate, the lights to flare, and the broker to drop his pen. For a single second, the ticking stopped. The hive mind stumbled, the collective consciousness of thousands screaming in a singular burst of dissonance. "Error," the broker shrieked, his face showing genuine, petrified terror. "System divergence. Integrity loss." The amber light turned blood red. The cathedral began to buckle, crystalline fragments raining down like razor-sharp hail. I didn't wait. I dove from the vent, landing hard amidst the breaking glass and swirling, toxic fluids. The machine was screaming, the infrastructure tearing itself apart, and for the first time, I wasn't part of the inventory. I was the anomaly that was going to burn this slaughterhouse to the ground. The cathedral was collapsing. It wasn't a structural failure, it was an existential one. As the central crystal fractured, the floor beneath the facility turned liquid, the concrete dissolving into a churning, gray sludge that tasted like iron and regret. The residents, those husks of people who had been feeding the machine, began to collapse in unison, their bodies sloughing off like discarded layers of dead skin. The broker was screaming, a sound of high-pitched, static-filled static as his own form flickered in and out of existence. He wasn't flesh and bone anymore, he was a glitch, a projection of the machine's desperate attempt to hold on to its own reality. He lunged toward me, his fingers elongated, razor-sharp ribbons of shadow, but he was losing his hold on the physical plane. Every time he stepped toward me, a piece of the architecture vanished, replaced by the howling, empty void of the outside world. I didn't run. I stood in the center of the devastation, my breath coming in deep, ragged gulps of air that finally tasted like nothing, no chemicals, no rot, just cold, neutral oxygen. I watched the machine die. It wasn't glorious. It was the sound of 1,000 voices finally falling silent at once, a sudden, crushing void that made the silence of the forest seem loud in comparison. McMahon emerged from the debris. He was smaller now, his massive frame withered and pale, his surgical gown hanging off his shoulders like a shroud. He looked at me, not with the predatory hunger of the butcher, but with a hollow, profound confusion. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched his own chest, where a dark, pulsing core of light used to be. It was gone, extinguished by the shattering of the crystal. "Why?" he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping wind. It was order. It was the only way to make sure nothing was ever lost. We were preserving the entirety of the experience. "You were eating it," I said, my voice steady, cold, and final. "You were stealing the right to forget. And there's nothing more human than the right to let go." He didn't argue. He simply closed his eyes, and with a soft, final sigh, he dissolved into a fine, gray dust that drifted away in the rising wind. He was gone. The architect of my nightmare was nothing more than a memory now, and even that was fading. I walked toward the remains of the front gate, which was now nothing more than a rusted, bent frame leading out into an open, empty field. There was no city on the other side. There was no highway. There was only the vast, indifferent expanse of the world, stretching out toward a horizon that didn't care about what had happened inside this industrial tomb. I looked back one last time. The factory was gone. The mansion in the woods was gone. Everything I had experienced over the last few weeks was being wiped from the map of reality, as if the universe were scrubbing a smudge off its lens. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard weight of the compass. It was the only thing that had remained, a physical tether to a life that had existed before the harvest. I started to walk. My arms still ached, my body was a map of scars and bruises, and I was, for all intents and purposes, a man who had lost everything, my scholarship, my belongings, my innocence. But I was walking. I was breathing. I was one, singular, flawed person in a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. The war of the machine was over, but the war of being alive had just begun. I didn't know where I was going, or who I would be when I finally reached a place where people lived, but I knew one thing: I was no longer an asset. I was no longer a variable. I was just me. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The sun began to crest over the horizon, casting a long, steady shadow behind me. I didn't look back at the void where the facility had stood. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, every step a painful, beautiful reminder that I had survived the harvest, that I had broken the cycle, and that the silence, at long last, was mine. The watch is over, boss. The history is written, and for the first time, there is no more data to collect. Just a road, a sunrise, and the rest of my life.